question of December 25th. Every year, families gather around Christmas trees, exchange gifts, and sing joyful carols, all to celebrate the birth of Jesus on December 25th, 3rd. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself, was Jesus actually born on this day? Or is this just a long-held tradition that doesn't have a firm biblical foundation? Think about it. If you search through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you won't find a single mention of Jesus' birth date, not even a hint that December 25th was the day Mary gave birth in Bethlehem. So where did this date come from? And if the Bible doesn't say it, could it be possible that Jesus was born at a completely different time of year? The answer might surprise you. Now, let's take a step back. The early Christians didn't celebrate Jesus' birth at all. Their focus was on his ministry, death, and resurrection. In fact, the first recorded celebrations of Christmas on December 25th didn't appear until hundreds of years after Jesus walked the earth. So, why did this date become the accepted tradition? Many scholars believe that the choice of December 25th had more to do with existing pagan festivals than with actual historical evidence. The Roman festival of Saturnalia, a lively celebration honoring Saturn, the god of agriculture, took place in late December. This festival was marked by feasting, gift-giving, and a temporary reversal of social roles. Later, another festival, Sol Invictus, which honored the unconquered sun, was celebrated on, you guessed it, December 25th. Some historians suggest that early church leaders may have chosen this date for Jesus' birth to provide an alternative celebration, one that would redirect attention from these pagan festivals to Christ. But while this historical explanation is fascinating, it still doesn't tell us when Jesus was really born. For that, we need to turn to Scripture. And while the Bible doesn't give us a direct date, it does provide clues, important pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, paint a much clearer picture. One of the first clues comes from the Gospel of Luke, which tells us about the shepherds in the fields on the night of Jesus' birth. Luke describes how these shepherds were keeping watch over their flocks by night, when an angel appeared to them, announcing the birth of the Messiah. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Shepherds in ancient Judea didn't typically keep their flocks out in the fields at night during the cold winter months. Instead, they brought them into shelters to protect them from the harsh weather. This small detail suggests that Jesus' birth may have occurred during a warmer season, perhaps spring or fall, rather than in the middle of winter. Another key detail lies in the historical context of a major event recorded in Luke's Gospel, the Roman census. This census, issued by Caesar Augustus, required people to return to their ancestral towns to be counted. Joseph and Mary had to make the long journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, an 18-mile trek that would have been extremely difficult in the winter, especially for a woman about to give birth. The Roman government, known for its efficiency, would have been unlikely to schedule such a massive population movement during a season of harsh weather. Instead, they likely held the census during a more practical time of year, such as the spring or fall, when travel was easier. So, if Jesus wasn't born in December, when was he actually born? Some researchers believe that we can get closer to the truth by looking at the timeline of another key biblical figure, John the Baptist. The Bible tells us that John was conceived about 6 months before Jesus, and based on details about John's father, Zechariah, and his priestly service in the temple, scholars estimate that John was likely born around March or April. If Jesus was born 6 months after John, that would place his birth in late September or early October, right around the time of the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles. Now, this is where it gets even more incredible. The Feast of Tabernacles was a celebration of God dwelling among his people. And what does the Gospel of John tell us about Jesus? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The idea that Jesus could have been born during this very festival is not just a coincidence. It's a powerful fulfillment of Scripture. So, what does all of this mean for us today? Should we stop celebrating Christmas on December 25th? Not necessarily. For centuries, this date has been a time for believers to reflect on the birth of Jesus and the gift of salvation he brings. But knowing the historical and biblical context helps us to appreciate the deeper meaning behind his birth. It reminds us that his coming was not just about a single day, but about God's divine plan unfolding throughout history. So, whether we celebrate in December or recognize that Jesus may have been born in a different season, one truth remains. The most important thing isn't the date itself, but the fact that he came, and that's something worth celebrating every day of the year. Clue 1. The census of Caesar Augustus. Now let's take a closer look at a major historical event that played a crucial role in the birth of Jesus. The census ordered by Caesar Augustus. This wasn't just a random bureaucratic decision. In fact, this decree set the stage for one of the most significant moments in human history. Imagine for a moment what life was like under Roman rule. The empire was vast, stretching across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And like any empire, it needed a steady stream of revenue. One way the Romans ensured this was through taxation, and to tax people effectively, they needed an accurate count of the population. That's where the census came in. The most powerful man in the world, Caesar Augustus. He has ordered a census, demanding that everyone return to their ancestral towns to be registered. This isn't just a request, it's an imperial command, one that disrupts lives and sets countless people on the move. For Joseph and Mary, this decree meant an arduous journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. We're talking about an 80-mile trek through rocky terrain and unpredictable weather. Picture it. A young, pregnant Mary making this exhausting journey on foot or perhaps on a donkey, all while nearing her time to give birth. It's hard enough to imagine this trip under favorable conditions, but think about doing it in the middle of winter. Now, if you've ever been in that part of the world during December, you'd know it's not all that welcoming. The chill in the air, the rain-soaked paths, and the biting wind would have made travel not just uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous. The Romans, notorious for their bureaucratic efficiency, would have known this. Would they really have ordered a mass migration at such a harsh time of year? Historically, Roman censuses weren't just about counting heads. They were about control, making sure everyone was accounted for, especially for taxation purposes. To do this effectively, they needed people to comply, which meant making it as convenient as possible. This is why many historians argue that such a census would have likely been scheduled during milder seasons, like spring or fall. During these times, travel was far more manageable. Roads were drier, the weather was pleasant, and people were already accustomed to traveling for various festivals and gatherings. If we follow this line of reasoning, it suggests something intriguing, that Jesus might not have been born on December 25th after all. Instead, he might have arrived in a season more suited for travel, perhaps in early autumn when the weather was gentle and the conditions were right for moving about. But this historical and logistical reasoning isn't where the story ends. In fact, it's only the beginning. While Caesar Augustus issued this decree as part of his imperial administration, he had no idea he was playing into a much larger narrative. A narrative written by the hands of prophets, long before he ever sat on Rome's throne. The prophet Micah, hundreds of years earlier, had declared, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient time." This prophecy pinpointed Bethlehem as the birthplace of a future ruler, the Messiah. Joseph and Mary were living in Nazareth, far from Bethlehem. It was this decree from a distant emperor that set them on the path to fulfill the prophecy. Without realizing it, Augustus was an instrument in the divine symphony God was conducting, a symphony that would change the world forever. So, while Augustus believed he was demonstrating his control over his vast empire, the reality was far different. His decree was not just a tool of political power, it was a mechanism through which God brought about his plan. Jesus, the true king, was born precisely where God intended, not because of human authority, but in spite of it. Let's step back and take this in. History shows us time and again that earthly powers often think they're the ones shaping destiny. But here, we see a profound truth. God's plans are not hindered by human decisions. Instead, they often unfold right through them. This Roman census, seemingly a mundane act of governance, was, in truth, the setting for the birth of the Savior. And as we dig deeper into these clues, each one leads us closer to understanding the real timeline of Jesus' birth. We start to see that perhaps it wasn't in the cold of December, but rather in a time when travel was feasible, aligning perfectly with the season of the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles, a celebration of God dwelling among his people. Isn't it fitting to think of Jesus, Emmanuel, meaning God with us, being born during a festival that celebrated God's presence? This perspective invites us to reconsider our traditions. It's not that celebrating on December 25th is wrong. It's a time when families and communities come together to reflect on the miracle of Christ's birth. But understanding the deeper context, the historical layers, and the divine orchestration behind these events gives us a richer appreciation. It reminds us that God's hand is always at work, often in ways we can't see until we step back and look at the bigger picture. So, next time you gather around your Christmas tree, think about the journey that brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. Think about how a decree from a distant ruler fulfilled a prophecy that echoed through the ages. And remember, the true miracle of Christmas isn't just in the date. It's in the timeless truth that God's love entered the world in the humblest of ways, and that love continues to guide history even now. What do you think? Could it be that the story we've always heard is even more incredible than we imagined? Let's keep exploring together as each clue brings us closer to the heart of this divine mystery. Clue 2. The priesthood of Zechariah, father of John the Baptist. Now, let's take a closer look at an often overlooked biblical figure whose story gives us an astonishing clue about when Jesus was really born. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. Zechariah was a priest, a man of faith who had spent his life serving God. He and his wife Elizabeth were both righteous, yet they had one sorrow: they were childless. In those days, this was seen as a sign of misfortune, but they had long accepted their fate. That is, until one fateful day when Zechariah's life changed forever. It happened during one of his scheduled temple duties. In those times, the Jewish priesthood was divided into 24 separate divisions, each serving at the temple for 1 week, twice a year. Zechariah belonged to the division of Abijah. Based on historical records, we can estimate that his division would have served in the temple around late May or early June. And that's when something incredible took place. Imagine Zechariah standing in the grand temple, the scent of burning incense filling the air. The atmosphere was still, sacred. Suddenly, a brilliant figure appeared before him, an angel of the Lord. Zechariah was stunned, even terrified, but the angel spoke gently, reassuring him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." Zechariah could hardly believe what he was hearing. He and Elizabeth were well beyond childbearing years. How could this be? In his doubt, he questioned the angel, and as a result, he was struck mute until the prophecy was fulfilled. But what does this miraculous event have to do with Jesus' birth? Let's break it down. Scripture tells us that soon after Zechariah returned home from his temple service, Elizabeth became pregnant, just as the angel had said. Now, here's where the timeline gets interesting. In the Gospel of Luke, we later learn that 6 months into Elizabeth's pregnancy, the angel Gabriel visited another person, this time a young woman in Nazareth named Mary. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus, Gabriel told her. This small but crucial detail gives us a timeline. Jesus was conceived 6 months after John the Baptist. Now, let's do the math. If Zechariah's temple service occurred around late May or early June, then Elizabeth likely conceived John shortly after, around June or early July. Add 9 months and John would have been born in March or April of the following year. And if Jesus was conceived 6 months after John, that would place his conception around December. Fast forward another 9 months, and we arrive September or early October. That's right. This biblical timeline strongly suggests that Jesus was born in the early fall, not in December. But there's more. If Jesus was born in September or early October, it would have coincided with one of the most significant Jewish festivals, the Feast of Tabernacles. This was a sacred time when Jewish families built temporary shelters, or tabernacles, to commemorate how God dwelled among his people during the Exodus. And here's where it gets truly fascinating. The Gospel of John tells us something remarkable about Jesus. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That word, dwelt, comes from the Greek word skenu, which literally means to tabernacle or to live in a temporary shelter. If Jesus was born during the Feast of Tabernacles, it would mean that his very birth fulfilled a prophetic symbol, God coming to dwell with his people in the flesh. Think about the profound meaning behind this. The Feast of Tabernacles was a time of joy, of celebration, of acknowledging God's presence among his people. And if Jesus was born during this festival, it would mean that his arrival wasn't just a historical event. It was a divine appointment, perfectly timed to align with God's redemptive plan. Now, this raises an important question. If the biblical clues point to a September or October birth, why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? The truth is, early Christians didn't celebrate Jesus' birth at all. Their focus was on his life, his ministry, his death, and his resurrection. The first recorded celebrations of Christmas on December 25th didn't appear until centuries later. Many scholars believe this date was chosen to coincide with Roman festivals, particularly Saturnalia and Sol Invictus, which were widely celebrated in late December. The idea was likely to provide a Christian alternative to these pagan holidays. But does that mean we should stop celebrating Christmas on December 25th? Not necessarily. For generations, this date has been a time for believers around the world to reflect on the birth of Christ and the incredible gift of salvation. The specific day may not match the historical reality, but what truly matters is the message behind it. Whether we acknowledge his birth in December or recognize the biblical clues pointing to the fall, the central truth remains the same. Jesus came. God dwelt among us, and that is worth celebrating every day of the year. Divine orchestration of events. We often hear about the miraculous birth of Jesus, but how often do we stop to consider the incredible ways in which God orchestrated every detail of that moment? It's one thing to think of Jesus' birth as a story of hope and joy, but if we zoom out and examine the full story, we see something even more powerful. A divine plan that involved kings, emperors, and priests. It was a masterstroke of timing and providence. a plan unfolding through the events of history itself. Take, for example, a seemingly mundane decree from the most powerful man in the world at the time, Caesar Augustus. Now, on the surface, this was just another act of political power. Caesar ordered a census to be taken throughout the Roman Empire. It was the sort of thing rulers did to maintain control over their vast territories, to gather information about their people for taxation and military purposes. Yet, as the ruler of the known world, he was unaware that his decree would play a pivotal role in fulfilling ancient prophecy. What's incredible is how God used this secular political decision to direct the course of history. Mary and Joseph, living in Nazareth, were forced to travel to Bethlehem for the census, as it was Joseph's ancestral home. The journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem was no easy feat. It was an arduous 80-mile trip that would have been particularly difficult for a pregnant woman, especially if it was winter, cold, rainy, and full of hardship. Yet, despite the inconvenience, Mary and Joseph made the trip. Why? Because God had a plan. The prophet Micah, hundreds of years earlier, had foretold that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, a small town in Judah. Had it not been for Caesar's decree, Mary and Joseph would have remained in Nazareth, and Jesus would have been born elsewhere. But because of the census, they found themselves in Bethlehem, and prophecy was fulfilled. Now let's pause here. This is not just about a Roman emperor's decision. It's a beautiful reminder of how God can work through anything, whether it's political power, bureaucracy, or even hardships, to bring about His will. The Roman emperor had no knowledge of the prophecy, yet he became an unwitting player in the divine drama. God was using even the secular rulers of the world to set the stage for the birth of His Son. This is a powerful reminder that, in the grand scheme of things, nothing is outside of God's control. But the story doesn't end there. Let's take a deeper look at another key character in this unfolding drama, Zechariah the priest. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, was a member of the priestly division of Abijah. According to Jewish tradition, the priesthood was divided into 24 divisions, and each division would serve in the temple for 1 week twice a year. So, Zechariah's division, the division of Abijah, would have served during specific weeks of the year. It's likely that Zechariah's temple service occurred in May or June. Now this is where things get interesting. While Zechariah was in the temple, performing his priestly duties, the angel Gabriel appeared to him, delivering the astonishing message that Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth would have a son. This child, who we know as John the Baptist, was to prepare the way for the Messiah. Zechariah, understandably, was incredulous. After all, Elizabeth was far beyond the years of childbearing. Yet, the angel assured him that nothing was impossible with God. Soon after, Elizabeth conceived, and she kept the pregnancy hidden for 5 months. But what's even more significant is the timing of all this. If Zechariah's service took place in the spring, Elizabeth's pregnancy would have been around December. That's when Mary, carrying Jesus, would have been conceived, 6 months after Elizabeth. Now, here's the incredible thing about all this. If John was conceived in June or July, he would have been born around March or April of the following year, and if Jesus was conceived about 6 months after John, that would place Jesus' conception around December. This brings us to a very intriguing point. Jesus' birth was likely in the fall, September or early October, around the time of the Jewish Feast of Tabernacles. This is a significant detail because the Feast of Tabernacles was a time when the Jewish people remembered how God had dwelt with them in the wilderness. It was a time to celebrate God's presence among His people. And what does the Gospel of John say about Jesus? The Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. John 1:14. That word, dwelling, is literally the same word used for tabernacle. Jesus, the Word, came to tabernacle among us. The timing of his birth, if it occurred around the Feast of Tabernacles, was no accident. It was a powerful symbol that the God who had once dwelled in a tent with his people had now come to dwell with us in human form. But why is this important? Why does this matter for us today? It's important because it shows us that God's plan was not random. Every event leading up to Jesus' birth was carefully orchestrated. From Caesar's decree to Zechariah's temple duties to the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, God was in control. The events surrounding Jesus' birth were not coincidental, they were divine appointments. The world may have thought it was just another Roman census, just another priestly duty, but God was using these moments to fulfill his perfect plan of salvation. This brings us to a profound realization. God's timing is perfect. He is never early and he is never late. He is always on time. In our own lives, when things feel uncertain or chaotic, we can trust that God's timing is perfect. He is working in ways we may not see, orchestrating events in the background, guiding us toward his purpose. So, as we look at the events surrounding Jesus' birth, we are reminded of something truly powerful. God's sovereignty is at work in our lives every day. Whether we see it or not, he is orchestrating events, moving pieces, and bringing his plan to fruition. And just like the people of that time, we too can trust that God is at work, even in the midst of our own struggles and challenges. He is with us, he is for us, and his plan is always perfect. As we reflect on the details we've explored, it's clear that the date of Jesus' birth might not be as straightforward as we've traditionally thought. Throughout the discussion, we've examined key historical and biblical clues that suggest a different timeline for the birth of Christ, one that points more likely to the spring or fall rather than the winter months. Let's recap the important points. First, we looked at the Roman census. The historical context behind this census shows us that the Roman Empire conducted censuses for various administrative purposes, and it would have been far more practical for Joseph and Mary to travel to Bethlehem during warmer weather. The cold, rainy winter months would have made an 80-mile journey treacherous, especially for a pregnant woman. This aligns with the idea that the Romans, known for their efficiency, would have likely scheduled the census during a time of year when travel was easier. Spring or fall. Next, we considered the timeline of John the Baptist's birth, which is linked to the priestly duties of his father, Zechariah. The priestly divisions were scheduled to serve in the temple at specific times of the year, with Zechariah's division, Abijah, serving around May or June. Since John the Baptist was born about 6 months before Jesus, this suggests that Jesus' conception occurred around December, pointing to a fall or early winter time frame for his birth, most likely around the time of the Feast of Tabernacles in September or October. When you combine these historical insights, the idea of a winter birth for Jesus seems less plausible. Instead, the clues point to a birth more likely occurring in the spring or fall. The December 25th date for Christmas, while deeply meaningful in the context of Christian tradition, may not accurately represent the historical timing of Christ's birth. This brings us to a deeper reflection. Why do we still celebrate Christmas on December 25th? The reason goes back to the early church, where leaders chose to align the celebration of Jesus' birth with the Roman festival of Sol Invictus, the festival of the unconquered sun, which took place near the winter solstice. This allowed early Christians to offer an alternative to a pagan celebration and highlight the arrival of the true light of the world in Jesus Christ. Although December 25th might not be the actual date of Jesus' birth, the meaning behind the celebration is still powerful. It's not about the precise date, but about recognizing the significance of the event. the birth of our Savior, who came into the world to bring hope, peace, and salvation. The traditions we celebrate today are a beautiful expression of the love and light that Jesus brought into the world, and they continue to hold profound meaning. In the end, while we've reconsidered the likely timing of Jesus' birth, it's important to remember that Christmas as we know it has evolved into a time to reflect on the deeper message of Christ's coming. Whether it falls on December 25th or another time of year, the true essence of Christmas remains unchanged. Jesus came to bring light to a dark world, and that is a truth worth celebrating every day. The date may be up for debate, but the reason we celebrate is crystal clear: the hope and love of Jesus Christ. The traditions we hold dear, the joy we share, the hope we find, these are what truly matter. Christmas is more than just a date on the calendar. It's a time to remember why Jesus came and to celebrate the love he brings into the world every single day. So, let's continue to cherish this beautiful season, regardless of when it falls on the calendar, because the message of Christmas is timeless. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video has given you a new perspective on the true meaning behind this beloved celebration. Stay blessed, and may the light of Christ fill your heart all year long. Dear brother, if you're going through a lot of troubles in life, we'd like to share with you some useful pieces of advice inspired by the content of this video. We hope these tips will be helpful to you. Lesson 1. God uses historical events to fulfill his plan of salvation. Although we might view the Roman census decree by Emperor Caesar Augustus as just a historical event, God used it as a tool to guide Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, where the prophecy of the Messiah's birth would be fulfilled. This event reminds us that God can use any circumstance, no matter how mundane or seemingly insignificant, to carry out his divine will. Lesson: we are encouraged to trust in God's providence and recognize that everything happening in our lives serves a greater purpose, even when we may not fully understand it at the moment. Lesson 2. Humility is key to embracing salvation. When Jesus came into the world, he did not choose a grand palace or a lavish celebration. He was born in a humble stable, surrounded by poverty and simplicity. This choice is a powerful message about humility. Jesus' birth teaches us that greatness does not come from wealth, power, or fame, but from serving others with love and humility. Lesson: we are called to live humbly, to lower ourselves in service to others, and to recognize that true greatness comes from humility and obedience to God. Lesson 3. Faith in difficult times. The journey of Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, especially in the harsh conditions of the weather, was no small feat. Yet they obeyed God's calling without hesitation. Their unwavering trust in God, despite the challenging circumstances, is an example for all of us. They believed that even in the toughest times, God would guide and protect them. Lesson: we too will face difficulties in our lives, but by trusting in God and remaining obedient to his will, we can overcome any challenge. Faith in God will lead us to the peace and blessings he promises. These lessons show us that the story of Jesus' birth is more than just about a date. It is a reflection of God's plan for our lives. We are called to live a life of faith, humility, and obedience, knowing that God's providence is always at work, guiding us through every circumstance. As we look at the birth of Jesus, let our hearts be filled with hope and trust in God's infinite love and divine plan for us.